Thank you all for attending today. My name is Shannon Crosby, and I'm a registered dietitian with CoxHealth Wellness, and today's presentation is on sodium. Today we're going to talk about what sodium is and what its functions are in the body, pretty briefly. We're going to talk about food sources of sodium and how to identify how much sodium is in foods. I'm going to give you recommendations on how to reduce the amount of sodium in your own diet, and we'll talk to you about the impact of sodium on the body, specifically blood pressure. Sodium is a mineral that is found in sodium chloride or table salt, and it's been a part of our diet since earliest recorded history. It's been used as a preservative, it's used as a flavor enhancer, it has lots of different functions in our food. In the body, it's an electrolyte. An electrolyte is a substance that carries a charge. That charge that sodium has allows it to move substances from various body compartments. For example, sodium regulates the flow of water. It's one of the strongest electrolytes that controls water fluctuations within the body. It also transmits nerve impulses, which signal the muscles to contract. And so sodium affects blood pressure in how it moves water. If excess sodium is consumed in the diet and therefore gets into the bloodstream, sodium will pull water into the bloodstream, and this creates an excess amount of blood that the heart has to pump. So the heart works harder to do that, puts extra pressure on the blood vessels, which can cause damage over time. We know that high blood pressure increases our risk for heart disease and diabetes and kidney disease and so on. Now, you might be surprised to know that the amount of sodium that the human body requires to carry out those normal functions is very, very small in relation to how much we get in our diet. In fact, the recommended amount for just basic human needs is only 180 milligrams a day. And that's about the amount of sodium in one slice of bread. So it's a teeny tiny amount compared to what we get. That amount of sodium would just barely cover the head of a penny. But to consume that amount of sodium in the diet would be virtually impossible for us to do. And so the recommended amount, according to the recommended daily allowances set forth by scientists and nutrition experts, is much, much higher. It's 1,500 milligrams a day. And so we have this graphic to kind of show you those different amounts and how they compare. So you can see there at the bottom we have the adult needed daily amount of sodium, which is 180 milligrams, and then the recommended daily amount, which is 1,500 milligrams, several times greater than that adult basic need. The upper limit for sodium intake, and so this would be the level at which we would need to consume sodium because more is going to impact our health potentially, is 2,300 milligrams. And that's about a teaspoon of salt. So this is the threshold that we really don't want to exceed because we can see health implications from that. That minimum level is the recommended amount for certain categories of people, specifically people who have high blood pressure, people who are older, because we have a more difficult time regulating this process as we get older. So over the age of 50, it's recommended that you consume closer to 1,500 milligrams a day. And then there are also other groups, people who have kidney disease, diabetes, who are recommended to stay around that 1,500 milligrams a day level. And for many people, this requires a lot of planning and thought because 1,500 milligrams is a pretty low amount in the typical American diet. In fact, average intake in the United States is closer to 3,400 milligrams a day, and in some studies even has found a significant amount of the population taking in closer to 7,000 milligrams a day. So we're taking in tons of sodium and much, much more than we actually require and more than that threshold by far. Most of the sodium in our diet comes from salt, and it gets to us in the form of processed foods. Salt is used, like I said, as a flavor enhancer, and then it's also used as a preservative and as a part of many other additives that are put in our processed food. So if you eat a diet of whole foods, foods closer to their original source with very minimal processing, you're going to just automatically cut out a significant amount of sodium in your diet. So that's what I encourage people to do if they're trying to reduce the amount of sodium. In the past, I feel like dietitians, nutrition experts have focused more on not salting your food at the table or using less salt in cooking. You've heard those messages before. And what does that occur? What occurs when you do that? You get really bland, tasteless food, right? Who wants to eat your vegetables when your vegetables taste, bland and like cardboard? Nobody. So my focus for people when I'm talking about reducing sodium is looking at those processed foods. And you'll see, I've got a great graph here, that 77% of the sodium in the average American diet comes from those processed foods. Only 6% is coming from salt at the table, and 5% is from salt at cooking. So if we can cut down the processed foods, we can enjoy salt in the food that we prepare ourselves, controlling the amount of sodium that we add. Very little foods, too, have natural sodium or very minimal amounts. So if you're eating fresh whole foods, you don't have to be concerned about them having a whole lot of natural sodium for most foods. So here's an example where we have fresh tomatoes, only 11 milligrams of sodium in a serving of fresh tomatoes. But when we look at canned tomatoes, so a process has been applied to the tomatoes, we have 335 milligrams of sodium. And most of this comes from a process that uses sodium hydroxide. And this is applied to the tomatoes to get the skin to fall off very easily. So that's where most of the sodium in canned tomato products is coming from. Condiments are another major source of sodium for many of us. Soy sauce, of course, is incredibly high in sodium, 900 milligrams for 1 tablespoon, and 190 milligrams for a tablespoon of ketchup. Worcestershire sauce, pickles, olives, seasonings like onion salt, garlic salt, celery salt are all major sources as well in the diet. Now, high blood pressure, as most of you probably are aware, puts us at a higher risk for cardiovascular incidents, things like heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, and peripheral artery disease. We have about 30% of the population that has high blood pressure right now, and it is rising. So this is something that we look for when we conduct our health risk assessments. And sodium in the diet definitely impacts blood pressure. In fact, 50% of people with high blood pressure are considered especially salt sensitive, where there's a very direct relationship between the amount of sodium that they take in and their blood pressure readings. We see it more frequently, salt sensitivity, in older people, people with diabetes and kidney disease, and African Americans. And so this is why these groups especially need to focus on a lower sodium diet, closer to that 1,500 milligrams a day. There's also a link between sodium intake and osteoporosis. Whenever we have high sodium in the diet, the kidneys have to work harder to get rid of the extra sodium. And through that process of ridding the body of sodium, calcium is also lost. And so it's thought that over a long period of time of consuming a high sodium diet, it can lead to less calcium, calcium being leached from the bone, which impacts the structure of the bone. It can weaken, and then as we get older, develop into osteoporosis, which we actually see a breaking of the bone. One of the diets that's been most extensively studied in regard to sodium is called the DASH diet. And the DASH diet stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. If you've been in healthcare a while, you've probably heard about the DASH diet. Like I said, it's been extensively studied, and people who follow this diet have seen a very marked decrease in blood pressure readings. It also is a diet that has been studied a lot in regard to weight loss, and weight loss can definitely lower blood pressure as well. And so the DASH eating plan is outlined on this slide. This would be a 2,000 calorie diet, so it could be less or more depending on a person's individual needs. And there are several things that really jump out. It's a plant-based diet, and so it has a high recommendation of grains. They're supposed to be whole grains, less processed grains. It has a higher recommended amount of dairy. Specifically, what's been used in the studies is lower fat dairy. And then it is also high in protein, so 6 servings or less of protein foods. But really the food that is the foods that are the basis for this diet are fruits and vegetables. And if you put those 2 servings together, you're looking at 8 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables each day. And these are more whole foods versus processed fruits and vegetables. So these foods are providing us with a low calorie level, a low sodium level, and very high in potassium, magnesium, which are important as well for blood pressure control. The dairy is providing calcium, which has also been shown to be helpful with blood pressure control. Notice too that it recommends 4 to 5 servings of nuts, seeds, beans, and peas per week. High fiber and high in those similar types of nutrients that are in the fruits and vegetables. And so this is the studies that have looked at DASH have really kind of reinforced that idea that nutrition greatly impacts blood pressure control, and consuming a lower sodium diet is helpful to do that. All right, so now I'm going to go over some of my recommendations for cutting sodium out of your diet. What do you need to do? And the first one is again, avoiding processed foods and eating more whole foods. So to kind of reinforce that argument, I've got a comparison here between a processed rice side dish, rice-a-roni herb and butter rice mix, versus making a similar type of recipe on your own, okay? So the rice-a-roni, for 1 serving, which is about 1/3 of a cup, you get over 1,000 milligrams of sodium. When you think about that 2,300, that is the threshold for most of us, this is 44% of that. That's that daily value, 44% of the daily value. If you make the rice on your own, and this was just a very basic recipe, nothing too time-consuming or complicated, you get about 5% of the daily value, 117 milligrams. So this is just a really strong argument for cooking your own food and avoiding boxed or prepared foods as much as possible. You can also look at the labels on foods to identify foods that have less sodium, processed foods that have less sodium. And these labels are defined, and their use is enforced by the FDA. So, for example, low sodium, sodium-free, both of these are going to indicate very, very low levels of sodium in the food. If it says reduced or less sodium, you have to kind of watch out, because it's comparing the amount of sodium in that reduced sodium food to the standard food. So for example, if we look at low sodium soy sauce, I told you soy sauce is very, very high in sodium, right? 900 milligrams per a tablespoon. Less sodium soy sauce has less, but it still has 575 milligrams per tablespoon. So for somebody who has to eat a lower sodium diet at 1,500 milligrams, soy sauce, even the low sodium type, isn't a good choice, because that alone is going to be 1/3 of their sodium recommendation for the day. Here's an example of chicken broth, which standard chicken broth is very, very high in sodium, 940 milligrams in 1 cup. The less sodium has about 24% less in this case. And then even the better choice would be unsalted chicken broth, which only has 45 milligrams of sodium per 1 cup. So paying attention to those packages and labels can be really helpful when you're shopping. And the best place to look is just simply for sodium. So sodium is one of those things that's required to be on the nutrition label. It's going to give you the total amount in a serving, but I think more helpful even is that percent, the percent daily value. For this dressing, we're getting 14% of our daily value, which is the 2,300 milligrams. Okay, so if you're not on a sodium-restricted diet, that's a good comparison. If you're trying to stay more toward 1,500, then you have to recognize that that percentage is going to be high for you. This type of prepared salad dressing, like I said, condiments and dressings and things can be really, really high. And for just 2 tablespoons to get you 14% of your daily value, that's a lot. So I really advocate, making your own dressings or looking for some that are just more oil and vinegar based that are going to be lower in sodium. You can also look at the ingredients list for sources of sodium. Like I said, sodium is used as a component of several different chemical compounds that are common additives in processed foods. And you can see the names of the different additives on the left. All of them have sodium in their name, so they're not difficult to identify. And then the purpose that they're used is listed on the right. So in addition to flavor enhancement, there are lots of other purposes of sodium in our food as well. And so this contributes to the very high presence of sodium in our diet. Reading the labels is helpful. Trying to cook your food on your own as much from scratch to reduce sodium is helpful. Some examples of ways that you can cut sodium. If you're a fan of, for example, canned soups, which are notoriously high in sodium, one thing that you can do to improve the balance in those foods might be to add vegetables to it. And I wouldn't add canned vegetables because canned vegetables are high in sodium as well, but maybe frozen or fresh vegetables. So as you're preparing the soup, and notice we've got a reduced sodium soup. It's still going to contain a fair amount, but less than the regular type of soup. And then we've added some frozen vegetables to that. So that's going to lower the sodium content and then also increase the amount of vegetables that you eat, which I'm always trying to convince people to do. Think about the processed meats that you consume. Unprocessed meats, whole muscle cuts of beef, pork, chicken, fish, are going to contain very little natural sodium. And so we can add sodium in limited amounts as we prepare those. But anytime we consume processed meats, we're typically adding significant amounts. So things like lunch meat, for example, are going to be very, very high in sodium. So if you consume lunch meat, look for lower sodium types, and then also pay attention to the servings that you consume. 3 ounces is a typical serving. That is usually, for most products, 3 slices, so limit it to that, and then bulk up on the virtually sodium-free vegetables to make sure that you're keeping balance with your sandwich. Or even better, I always talk to people about when you cook, preparing extra meat, extra chicken, extra beef, extra pork, whatever you're preparing, and then save that in the refrigerator, and you can use that meat for sandwiches and quick meals, wraps, salads, etc., because that's going to be the most low sodium choice when it comes to protein. Snacks are a big issue. A lot of us like our processed snacks, pretzels and chips and things like that. So what do you do for snacks? One option might be to, if you're using nuts, instead of consuming like a trail mix or processed nuts that have salt or sugar added to them, make sure that you're looking toward raw nuts. You can make your own trail mix pretty simply using nuts and add some dry fruit to that, and that can be a better snack alternative that's lower in sodium. And then here's the salad dressing example. Many salad dressings are pretty high in sodium, and so switching the types or making your own, focusing on like a vinaigrette that doesn't have a lot of added sodium is helpful. One of the major sources of sodium for most Americans comes from restaurant foods. And that's primarily because most restaurants, especially fast food restaurants, fast casual type restaurants, chain restaurants, they utilize a lot of processed food when they're producing their foods. And so that's going to equal more sodium, like I've mentioned several times. So if you're paying attention to a lower sodium way of eating or trying to eat healthier, I would recommend limiting the amount of meals that you eat at restaurants to 1 to 2 per week. And then also when you choose restaurants to eat at, you're better off finding restaurants that do make their food from scratch. And that can be difficult to do. You're talking about non-chains and maybe more locally owned type restaurants, maybe asking questions of the servers when you go to the restaurants, asking for things like having your sauce on the side, asking them to lightly salt your foods instead of what they would typically do can be helpful as well. And then watching your condiments is important to try to eat less sodium. You can also balance, if you have something that has a sauce or that's going to be higher in sodium, consume less of that and ask for extra vegetables to create more balance on your plate between those higher sodium and lower sodium foods. But in my opinion, really the best way to avoid this is to eat out less. All right, so in conclusion, I hope I've presented an argument for why you probably need to watch the amount of sodium that you eat. One study that I found that reducing sodium intake to less than 2,300 milligrams can lower your blood pressure by 8 to 14 points, and then following the DASH diet in addition to that lowers it an additional 8 to 14 points. I mentioned weight loss is a really significant blood pressure lowering mechanism, and so 5 to 20 points for that, in addition to exercising and watching your alcohol intake. If you have questions about sodium in your diet, I encourage you to reach out to me either today while I'm here, or you can also click on the Ask a Dietitian button on your wellness dashboard. And this is a great way to connect with me if you need more information or recipes or suggestions on lowering the sodium in your diet.